So I see we have 50 participants now, Vanessa. It's good.
Yes, let's allow
52.
1 more minute. Let's allow more people to attend for the next minute, so then we can start.
55. This is like, now, do we have any more?
Yes.
Who can give us 60? Okay, let's see.
Hey, good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Welcome. We're gonna be waiting for the next minute, so most people can join, and then we can start our webinar. Maybe grab a coffee, and we'll see you the next few minutes, 1 to 2 minutes, and then we can start. To all the participants logging in, would you mind sending us on the chat your name and where you come from, so we know a little bit more about you, maybe your affiliation and your current location for the webinar stats? One more minute, and then we can start, Mark.
It's very nice. I'm seeing lots of people I haven't seen in a long time, including Malcolm Clark from New Zealand. So he must be late at night for him.
Yeah. Okay, so welcome everybody. Good morning, evening, afternoon, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure for us to be hosting this webinar. In the name of MBON and all the organizers, we welcome you to this. We're very excited to have you and to hear this very interesting webinar today. Today we have the pleasure to welcome Mark Costello. Mark is a professor of University in Norway. and a leading marine ecologist specializing in biography, marine protected areas, and climate change impacts on biodiversity. He pioneered the ocean biodiversity informatics and has authored over 300 peer-reviewed publications, and has served as a lead author in the IPCC, and he currently leads MPA Europe and MPA Europe project, mapping priority areas for protected marine protected areas, biodiversity, and carbon store across European seas. In this webinar, Mark will present key findings from MPA Europe initiative, showing you how systematically planned MPA networks can achieve ambitious conservation targets. So many thank you everybody for joining, and Mark, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Okay, you can hear me still, Vanessa? Yeah.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. So, and this talk is timely because we've just about finished the MPA Europe project, so we actually have lots of results.
I'm sorry, Mark. Sorry, your presentation is on the presenter side.
Oh,
Maybe can you switch the screens? Yeah.
yes, I can switch. Thank you. It was okay the last time, and
Yeah.
now is that better?
Yes.
No, or I can
No.
make it the same on both. I have two screens.
Okay.
Are you seeing screen sharing now, or is it?
Not yet on my side.
Okay, so it locked itself out of them. Now, which way do you see it?
Yeah, now it's perfect. You can
Perfect.
carry
Okay.
on. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is first introduce systematic conservation planning and the science base for prioritizing where to put conservation effort. I'll give some examples at a global level, and then I'll go into the Marine Protected Area Europe project and our results and how we went about it. And then at the end, I'll give some slides about some of the things that stakeholders felt. We had stakeholder meetings throughout the project, and the misconceptions they had about some things, which I like to call zombie ideas, because these are ideas that are floating around that people should know they should be dead long ago, but people still think them. A bit like some of the things maybe I learned in university, I still think are true, but maybe they're not so true. So in nature conservation, we need to prioritize where we put effort. And when it comes to areas, we want to save species from extinction. That's the ultimate thing we want to stop happening. So we want to move people away from species away from that path towards extinction. So what scientific evidence can we use to guide area planning? Now, the second part of conservation planning, which I won't go into here, but although some of the comments of stakeholders later will be relevant, is first you have the scientific evidence, and then you have, of course, have to go to people to decide how to negotiate those management actions and activities and where you put the boundaries and so on. And in the Azores, who I thank for hosting this meeting, they're one of the leaders in this and have used both of these methods and gone through the full process and decided where to have the marine protected areas and what type of management will be in each one. Now, when we want to do this planning, often on land, we have very good observations of where species and habitats occur, partly because we can use aircraft and satellites to map exactly where the habitats are and people are out observing species. So on land, people can actually do their conservation planning based on empirical observed information. This becomes more difficult in the ocean because we have huge sampling bias. So the two ways of covering that, one is using expert drawn maps of where they think a species might live, what its range is. And this is what the IUCN Red List does. And the second is to produce species distribution models. We use environmental data to map the environmental niche and thus the geographic distribution of species. So it was a very nice paper by some of our European colleagues, came out last year in Trends in Ecology and Evolution, which describes systematic conservation planning. And of course, most of them are marine biologists, so they have some nice marine examples there. But the core of the idea is that if you have a species in the little table they have here, and you have sites, you can see that it's not necessarily the sites with the most species that are the best to protect. It's what you want is a network of sites which collectively protects as many species as possible. And sometimes people don't really grasp that it's the network is important. We're designing a network, not just picking sites. Because if we just had only one site in the world, then it would make sense to protect the one site with most species. But we're trying to protect a network because biodiversity and species are not equally distributed around the world. And a few years ago, with Chen-Xue Zhao, as part of his PhD, he did this mapping in a paper in biological conservation. And these red areas are the top 30% of the ocean. And in that time, we didn't have a lot of individual species maps. So we used surrogates for habitats and ecosystems to actually guide this planning. But you can see that most coastal areas, mid-Atlantic ridges, around the islands, around the Azores Islands in the Pacific and Indian Oceans are all prioritized because that's where we get a lot of the endemic species are against coastlines and on islands. And that's not the only study. In fact, there are 6 systematic prioritization studies published for the oceans, and not one of these is referenced by the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it's kind of surprising that we all go to university, we learn the best scientific methods, and then none of these are used by countries at an international scale. But at a national scale, countries are using them. California used systematic conservation planning, so did New Zealand and Australia, Israel, and the Azores. So it is being used in some ways, but not internationally so far. If we're to look at the whole world, this is a paper we just published last year in Ecography. We took the IUCN Red List and we looked at where you would want to prioritize areas. So this is land and sea, and you can see lots of these dark areas on land are the highest priority areas. And the prioritization algorithm on this graph here, and I'll show more graphs like this, is the proportion of the study area under protections at the bottom. And along the vertical axis is the proportion of species that can be protected. So this is showing you that if you went to 50% of the area, you could, and you selected those best areas, and that doesn't mean people are excluded, of course. It could be many people live in areas with wildlife. You could protect all species in half the planet. And the lines here show the IUCN Red List endangerment status from critically endangered, which is the strong red line, which is the top line of this graph. So what the prioritization algorithm does is it prioritizes the rarest species, because rare species can only be protected where they occur, and some of the common species will be with them. So the algorithm selectively protects, so you could actually protect nearly all the critically endangered in 30% of the planet, for example. And the data species of least concern, the blue line, is less prioritized. And on the left, I have a little graph showing that we have a table in the paper showing all the individual studies on mammals and birds and reptiles. And it's actually remarkably consistent that these percentage area where percentage of species can be protected, when you look at it at these large global and regional scales across different taxa, which is kind of reassuring. So talking about the Marine Protected Area Europe project, we have a series of 10 partners in the project, of whom I was going to say they're all in Europe, but I guess 2 are in Britain now. They're still part of Europe, but not the European Union. So we're very lucky to have a great team of people with special interests in environmental data, biodiversity data, organic carbon and blue carbon stores as well, and science communication as well. So the idea of the project was to map the optimal locations over all European seas. So this also includes some high seas areas in the Mediterranean and Black Sea, but we didn't extend out into the high seas in the Atlantic. So that's our study area, and our priorities were to look at biodiversity, and we originally thought we'd look at ecosystems and habitats and species, and also blue carbon. And on our website, we have a list of all the deliverables. Almost all of them are downloadable from Zenodo. There'll be more coming out in the next couple of months. And also on the website, we've got various news reports on the project, as projects do. We spent a lot of time meeting with stakeholders at a regional level in the Baltic Sea, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Black Sea. And this was designed so that we got feedback on what stakeholders are really wanting. And one of the encouraging messages was from all the workshops is that stakeholders wanted good science. It's one thing going to negotiate with people and with governments and other agencies, but everybody at the end of the day, we need to know what are the facts on the ground. Because when you're deciding where to locate conservation areas, you don't want to make mistakes, and you don't want to be if you've got people who are sort of negotiating on self-interest basis, you want to point out to them, well, a species does occur there, so it doesn't occur anywhere else. So this is where it needs to be protected, for example. So this was a huge effort by the Cleanazol team of Tanis Smanis and Belinda Bramley and others. Now, and we have a lot of an FAQ on the website, which I won't run through, but if people are interested, you can go and look at the stakeholder feedback we had to their frequently asked questions there. So what we're hoping at the end of the day is to produce a graph. This is from that global study I mentioned previously by Zhao. We want to aim for about 80% of biodiversity within 30% of the area. In this example, we've got a solid red line, which is species richness. We're getting about 75% of species, perhaps in 30% of the area in the world here. And then each of the other lines are different aspects of biodiversity. So you could look at kelp, which is the top line, is not so well protected, and then coral, mangrove, seagrass. But in all of these cases, the ideal situation is if you have a full list of species, because then you can group the species which are important for kelp or coral or mangroves, and then see how they plot out in the analysis. So one of the first steps we did was George Assis and his colleagues in the Algarve at CCMAR expanded the BioOracle database, which has been very successfully providing open access environmental data layers for all of the oceans at different depths. So they greatly updated this and added also the different future environmental conditions. So we now have the present day temperatures, for example, plus the future predicted temperatures and statistics from them. So we could use these to actually model where the species are now based on present temperatures, and then where they might be in the future based on future temperatures. Mike Burrows at the Scottish Association of Marine Sciences developed a new wave exposure scale, because as a marine ecologist in the beginning, the first thing we learned from working on rocky seashores and coastal areas is that wave exposure is probably the most important variable in shallow water influencing the distribution of species. Yet this relatively easily calculated index is missing from all the global data sets. And from that, we also had some side studies on oceanographic connectivity and so on, which I won't get into in details here. We also had another study looking at species biogeography using the InfoMap bioregions method. So this takes species composition data from different cells and it plots them out. It can use range maps, which is the top map from aqua maps, the bottom map, or it can take individual records. And there are other global studies which have mapped biogeography. And in all these cases, they always show that the Baltic and Black Seas are somehow different because they have freshwater species. The Mediterranean always stands out. And then we usually get an Arctic and a North Sea and Celtic Seas area on the continental shelf. And then the coast of Portugal, the northern coast of the Iberian Peninsula also stands out. And then we have these offshore areas. And some other studies we we're just working on now too shows that the Azores, Canary Islands, and the coast of Africa also have distinct species. So when we do our network design based on this biogeography, which is a bit broad and not very spatially accurate, perhaps, we should have areas should come out of the species analysis, which cover all these different areas of the oceans. So the network includes species from all those areas. So we also expanded the OBIS database. So it now had 35,000 species reported from Europe, over 67 million records. And from that, we're able to model the ranges of about 12,000 species, of whom a little over, well, nearly 2,000 are actually species introduced to Europe, especially species introduced via the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. So, of course, for our analysis, we want to look at native ranges. So we were then able to look at the modeled ranges of 10,000 species. So this is the Shiny app, or Shiny app, which is on OBIS now. And this contains a lot of information that people could use for many different purposes. On the figure here, I show you the black data points are the reported locations for the common European oyster, Ostrea edulis. But it also, the web page provides the different models that are produced, the range map, the future climate change scenarios, and then further on down the web page, there's a lot more information on the source data, and everything is open access and available freely for people to use, and even we run their own models. So then we take the environmental data from BioOracle and this biological data, we put it together, we map the niche of each species, and then we use that niche to map that back to the geographic areas to come up with these range maps of species. And of course, we need to keep in mind that a big assumption in this project is that the species can be everywhere within their range. We don't actually know that for sure, because in some areas, maybe species have been driven out by pollution in heat waves or pollution or heavy fishing. So the species might not now be everywhere within their potential range, just like on land, if you can compare it with land species. So in a way, this result is giving you the broader regional context for conservation planning, but it also means that you still need ground truth data when you go to take local action. So it was quite interesting to look at the future distributions as well. This is the number of fish species in the current period. So we're overlaying the range maps of the species. We see most species around the Azores and the southern part of the ocean and in the Mediterranean, less species as we go north. And then by the year 2100, under the most extreme climate change scenario, we do see a shift of species up to the northern regions, which is actually already happening, and there's plenty of evidence for that. And we see perhaps a decline in the number of species down here in the Mediterranean. So from the Atlantic point of view, species can move easily up north and south across the Atlantic and within their depth ranges. But in the Mediterranean, we don't know if these species in the Mediterranean can escape into the Atlantic to survive. If we look at individual species, which you can do all on the website, this is an example for one of the species of rays. And it's interesting that when you look from the current to the future, we see the increase up here, but it's still going to be present everywhere in its present range. And actually, that's the case for almost all species. Most species have quite large geographic ranges. So even under future climate change, we won't see changes in their distribution in most of their range. So most species will still be in the future where they are today. And this is kind of a surprise in some ways, but makes sense in other ways when we think about it. But often when scientists talk about species moving, we give the impression that they're moving everywhere, but they're not moving everywhere. They're only moving where the environment has changed. They're either leaving an environment that's become unsuitable because it's too warm, or they're moving into a new area because it's now become warmer and more suitable for them. So that's our second kind of key message, is that even within the worst case scenarios, most species will be in the future where they are today. And we'll see increased richness in the Arctic and possible loss of some species in the Mediterranean. So a key question for Mediterranean researchers is now to focus on those Mediterranean species will they survive in the Mediterranean, or how can they survive? Maybe they'll find depth refugia, or maybe they're more tolerant to extreme temperatures than we actually realize. They can adapt. So when we run our analysis, this is the core result here. On the left is a nice color map going from red, which is highly prioritized, to dark blue, which is less prioritized. So every cell in the region has a score. So you could actually map the 1% region. On the right, we've mapped the 10%. And you can see the 10%, without even putting the coastline on it, is kind of showing you where the coastlines are all around Europe, including all the islands. But if you look on the left, we also see that the edges of the continental shelf, from the Bay of Biscay around Ireland, areas around Iceland, there's also some offshore areas that are very important to protect, including around the Azores. And as you probably know, these coastlines in the red areas in the Mediterranean also include deep sea, as they do off Norway, because the continental shelf in Norway, parts of Portugal, and the Mediterranean is very narrow. So you can actually have from 0 to 1,000 meters within a few kilometers offshore. If we looked at the data that's not in the species distribution maps, these are the data points here, we can see that these are more or less in the same area. So we think the species range maps are representative of all the species in Obus. But we have another way of testing that as well, which I'll come to. If we look at the maps for 10% on the left, 30% and 50%, this is what they look like. So gradually the 10% just keeps expanding. So we don't see dramatic changes overall pattern as we add more areas. And if people chose these optimal areas, they could protect almost 60% of species in 10% of the area and 30% in 80%. I had an amusing reaction from referees to the ecography paper, and they said, well, if you prioritize areas and you pick to prioritize first, then there's less, it's less a priority to include the additional areas. And we said, yes, that's true. That's what prioritization means. But they really struggled with this idea. They seem to think that you should be prioritizing all the time, but obviously it's a curve. It's not a straight line. But it does mean that it's the first 10% is the most important. And also this first 10%, remember from the previous graph, is also the one which will have most of the endangered species in it. So if we could just focus on getting 10%, it might be better, a good 10%, it might be better than aiming for a weak 30% or 50%. And if we want to look at that in another way, so this is the full set of species is the blue line just at the bottom. The habitat forming species are in green. The species listed of nature conservation concern in the Habitats and Birds Directives and Marine Strategy Framework Directive are in the red line. And the threatened species by IUCN are in the red line. The EU legislation ones are in the line that's parallel with it. It's kind of orange. But we wanted to test how many species you need to get a representative result. So this little graph we have here shows the percent spatial mismatch. So if we ran the analysis based on just 2,000 species, we can see that there's only about a 2% difference between that and the 10,000. So it's almost identical. So we think that this 10,000 species is more than enough to be representative of all species in Obus, all 35,000 species in Europe. So that's how we deal with representativity. Yeah, and there again, you can see the lines as in the previous graph. 30% and 10% gives you 50-something% and 80-something%. Of course, this varies greatly between countries because countries vary in size. So small countries might find it very hard to include all their biodiversity within 10% of the area. Such you see small countries down the bottom of the table here, like Slovenia and Jersey and Belgium. So they can only get 16 to 19% of species in 10% of the area. Whereas larger countries like Sweden or the Canary Islands, which isn't that large, I suppose, but might have a large EEZ, and Norway, could get over 60% to 76% of their species in 10% of the area. And some responses we got from people was that this is very unfair, but it is maybe unfair, but this is the same way that birds are prioritized for protection in Europe. So bird populations under the Birds Directive are prioritized based on the numbers, the percentage of a population of a species in different countries. And it's just the way nature is, that some countries have a lot more of some bird species than others. And it's the same with marine biodiversity. So that's the reality of the science, and how management will deal with that is a good question. We also had people worried about were we including deep sea biodiversity, but which we are, because some of those apparently coastal areas do include deep sea habitats. And if we look, here's the blue line is the top 10%. We've got depth in the ocean along the bottom of the axis. There's actually some of the cells that are recommended in the top 10% are around 5,600 meters depth. And the gray area is all of the areas within all the depth intervals within Europe. So as we showed for the ecography paper looking at global diversity, we also see the same effect here, so that the critically endangered species, which is a solid red line, is shifted to the left, which means that they're prioritized more than other species. So that's good news too. That's what we want. If we look at different parts of the ocean, and we've done these for every country's exclusive economic zone, we can see that in the Mediterranean, you can actually protect more species in a smaller area than you can in other areas, which is an interesting question as to why that's the case. I think it's probably because in the Mediterranean, you have such a narrow shelf that you can get many shallow and deep water species within an area quite close to the coast. And then for climate change, if we run the models max end for the present day and the future one, the areas that it recommends to protect are almost identical. And this is because many of the reasons of species protection areas, not just temperature, but it's also the seabed type, the oceanography. So many of these other factors will probably stay the same under climate change. And also, as we know, most importantly, the overall range of a species, it's only going to change its distribution where the environment exceeds its tolerances. So this is also good news. It means that the recommended network is climate resilient. So we think we have enough species. We think what we call the representative biodiversity areas are ecologically representative and they're climate resilient. It's also interesting to think about that almost any area of the coast, when you look in detail, of course, it's not every area, could make a positive contribution. So when it comes to starting, we should just kind of get started and start protecting, having marine reserves and protected areas where people will support it first, because I'm quietly confident that once people see the success of some of these protected areas, like they did in New Zealand and other countries, that they will welcome more of them to protect marine biodiversity. And also I put a note here that we don't take into account the abundance and breeding locations of species. So this is something that for birds is well known, but for marine species, it's less well known. We really don't know for a lot of marine species where their most important breeding or feeding areas are. So if a species is endangered or threatened with extinction, such as some of our megafauna, then we still need to look at those species individually and see how to protect them best. Especially if those species are moving quite a lot through the area, we want to avoid them getting killed as bycatch in fisheries. We were also asked in the call for proposals to look at some other climate factors. So the one we looked at was carbon storage and sediments. So Dorte Kraus Jensen and Christian Lundberg and their colleagues created a database with many collaborators. This has now been published, of organic carbon data and sediments around European seas and some deep sea areas. The database is online, and with George Assis's help from BioOracle, we actually model these data then to produce a map of likely concentrations and sediments all over our study area and beyond. So you can see the yellow, the red areas are the highest concentrations, which are so small you can't see them. They're all the fjords, estuaries, and coastal areas of Norway and the Baltic Sea, parts of the middle of the Black Sea as well, lots of organic muds and sediments. And blue is areas that are relatively low organic carbon content. So the concern here is obviously that dredging or trawling these areas and releasing the organic carbon back into the water, it gets mineralized into carbon dioxide. This affects ocean acidification, and it also affects the buffering and ability of the water to absorb more carbon dioxide from the air, and ultimately might result in more of the sea releasing carbon dioxide. And already many areas of the ocean release carbon dioxide at certain times of the year. So we don't want to be releasing more carbon dioxide from the ocean if we can avoid it. So the next question was then, well, are these the same areas that we could protect biodiversity? Well, unfortunately not. There's no correlation between the areas that are prioritized for biodiversity or species conservation and with high carbon stores and sediments. Of course, there'll be some areas that will be and some areas that won't. So, but on average, there's no simple correlation. And this is not surprising because areas with most organic carbon tend to be wave sheltered, sometimes anoxic, and very muddy. So these are very specialized habitat, and not many marine species will live in them, but some do, of course. So we have this map available, which can be used independently of the protected areas to inform where trawling should be allowed, or dredging, or other human disturbance activities in sediments. So we know where the highest organic carbon is probably in these sediments around Europe. But spatial planning should be considering protection of biodiversity and carbon stores as separate issues in some ways. What am I doing? Time. So some of the things that stakeholders came back to us about and that we picked up in discussions. So I listed 10 here, could probably have more or less. And I've already pointed out that the first one, countries use best scientific practice to locate marine protected areas. Well, actually, internationally, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, they don't. They use ad hoc planning, where somebody volunteers to create a protected area somewhere, and other countries say, oh, that's fine. But that's not really scientific. That's it's better than nothing, but it's not the ideal situation. And I'll run through these other ones then quickly. So most people, even in nature conservationists, assume that when an area is called protected, it's protected. And that's the way it usually is on land. If you have a protected area on land, you don't allow hunting, you don't allow cutting of trees, and so on. Unfortunately, this isn't the same in the ocean. The second is that the IUCN categories has got 6 or 7 categories of protected areas, that these all aim to protect biodiversity. And it's a bit confusing because some of the literature says they do, but when you read the actual definitions, they don't, because some of them are prioritized to protect geological areas or single species or single habitats, and not all aspects of biodiversity. And there is a world database, which is the best source of information on terrestrial and marine databases. And I show some graphs from it here. So this is a paper we had a few years ago in Trends in Ecology. A colleague had asked me to see what is the proportion of the protected areas that were aimed to be fully protected. And we were a bit shocked because over 90% of the protected areas, this is years down at the bottom and number of areas here, only 6% aimed to fully protect all aspects of nature. The others were sort of some kind of protection. We weren't quite sure what, because that data wasn't available. And over 3/4 of coastal countries had no marine reserves, that is, no take, no fishing, marine protected areas. So most countries don't even know what they're missing. And it's still the same. 10 years on, if we look at the graph for land and look at the graph for sea and coastal areas, coastal is land and sea protected together, we can see this widening gap between full protection, the lines at the bottom, and partially protected, the lines at the top. And we don't know what partially protected means. It means everything from actually no protection whatsoever to sometimes reasonably good protection, but we just don't know. So I could nickname this the con in conservation, is that protected doesn't really mean protected, especially when it's under the sea. Most of these areas don't protect biodiversity, because if you want to protect biodiversity, you need to protect all the species and the functions in that ecosystem. You can't kind of just protect one. Or you can't just call the area protected and leave human activities going on as usual. And this exaggeration of protection is actually increasing. Right. And another thing that keeps popping up is that people are not allowed in protected areas, which is a complete nonsense. There's almost no protected areas which really ban public access. There's some in the Mediterranean. There may be some in other countries as well, but they really are a minority, and they're usually very, very small areas. In fact, the opposite is the case. In New Zealand, which was one of the pioneers in protected areas, this is the Lee Marine Reserve, established in 1975. It became hugely popular with the public, much to everybody's surprise, way more popular than it ever was before. Yeah, and now they have a great program there called Experiencing Marine Reserves. It'd be wonderful to have that in Europe, where you can send out people floating around in wetsuits to look at what the marine life is like inside and outside the reserves. And one of the predictions by the scientists in the lab in the 1970s was that maybe fish will become tame, because spearfishing is quite popular in New Zealand. So maybe the fish in the reserve will learn that it's safe. And indeed they do. You can swim right up and the fish almost touch people, which is a bit frightening when some of the fish they're pretty big. And also people seem to think, the idea of protected areas is radical, or to exclude or manage public access or other human activities. But we do this all the time on land. There's many areas set aside for the public benefit. The ocean is a public space, so why can't we set aside more of the ocean for all the public to benefit from? And marine protected areas usually facilitate rather than exclude public access. And limiting public access to any area is not unusual, even in the ocean. There's many areas that are harbors, marinas, industrial areas, military zones, where the public is excluded for various commercial and political and management reasons. So it'd be very interesting to actually map how much of the area of the ocean the public is already excluded from compared to the areas that we have for marine protected areas. And another criticism is that pelagic species can't be protected in marine protected areas, so there's no point in trying to. So areas are declared protected, but they only ban bottom trawling or seabed fishing, and they allow pelagic fishing. But there's a recent paper, which is not this one here, which showed that, in fact, pelagic species are more sensitive to overfishing than benthic, because ships can so effectively put a net around whole schools of pelagic fish. But this study here was from the area of Hawaii, famous for various political reasons. Two American presidents created and expanded it, and the present one is trying to cancel it. But what they found was that as you moved outside the first graphs here with the little blue circles are the islands and the protected area around them, with different colors showing the zones. And once you move to the before and after, you get this boost of pelagic species richness outside the protected areas afterwards. And this is due to the spillover effect. So the populations of pelagic fish, particularly of tuna, billyfish, but also some others, has increased so much inside the reserves that they're swimming out, and this is helping the fisheries. And this spillover effect is almost universal. And that was in Hawaii, and there's many other areas within the Pacific Ocean and Indian Oceans that have been declared protected. And it's not expensive to set them up. There's a lot of concern about who pays for the marine protected areas. Well, it's kind of only common sense in most of these countries. They realize that they want to protect the resources. So instead of allowing resources to be depleted and then worrying about how to restore them, they want to protect them from the beginning and then allow careful use and sustainable use. It's kind of common sense and it's a precautionary principle, but somehow the word precautionary principles doesn't seem to have been applied very much in the oceans. And most of these large protected areas are actually not in rich countries. So this kind of shows you that you don't need a lot of money to declare protected areas. You just need good enforcement and regulation. But also, the reason there's a cost to protected areas is usually because there was no management of anything there before. Because if you have nice, simple management, and this has been shown in economic studies, that the simplest and lowest cost method of managing a marine protected area is to have no fisheries and to limit any extractive activities. And then you could limit public access, which might even would generate tourism revenue at the very least. There's also good evidence of spillover benefits, which I'll come back to in a moment. So looking at pollution, so people say MPAs don't protect against pollution. Well, pollution is something that people allow. So if people want to allow pollution in a marine protected area, it's not the fault of the marine protected area. That's a fault of bad management. And there's probably many cases, I know of a few, where pollution was happening, and local authorities do take greater effort to prevent pollution such as sewage or algal blooms happening in areas that are protected, because they know those areas are more important than others. So they will make a special effort. And people have wondered if climate change will happen in protected areas, and increasingly there's more studies. This is one from Desano Benedetti Cecchi in Italy and other colleagues, where they find that marine protected areas are more resilient. So protected area will often have richer, larger populations of species. Larger populations are by nature more resilient to loss and to stress, such as heat waves and climate warming. So there also areas with deep water nearby or with shading from algae can also provide some resilience against heat waves. So I published a paper a couple of years ago in Scientia Marina, which has a long table listing studies that I was looking for studies actually that showed the loss to fisheries from marine protected areas, because there's always seems to be this conflict that marine protected areas, I've actually heard speakers saying protected areas just kick out fisheries and they lose the catch. There's plenty of theoretical papers by fishery economists assuming that the fish are somehow lost when you create a marine protected area, as if they disappeared off the planet. So I was looking for examples and I couldn't find any. And I spent quite a few years looking, and I asked people on the Octo email list, who's got a list of about 12,000 species. And we couldn't find one study where a fishery had lost catch due to a marine protected area. There are some studies where marine protected areas weren't implemented properly or were too short term, so there was no catch benefit, so there was no spillover, and usually a continued decline in fisheries. But I found 48 studies which showed benefits or recovery of fished species of commercial fishery importance. So this table here points out that there's about 90% of those 51 studies here showed the benefits. 8 of them reported spillover, but probably all of them were actually having some spillover in terms of increased catch, body size of fisheries, and so on. So this is a summary graph of it. Another point is that these studies didn't just happen in one country, but in many countries and many oceans, in North America, to New Zealand, Australia, Africa, Europe, the Caribbean countries as well, and Asia and Japan. So I think this is a general rule that if you protect everything, and actually 91% of those studies had no fishing in those marine protected areas. So most of those areas that showed benefits had full protection. That if you fully protect things, that the populations recover, you end up with the spillover of juveniles and others into the area, and you get these fishery benefits. Similarly, you get lots of tourism benefits, which I won't go into details, but also depending on locations or places all around the world are showing benefits from marine protected areas, up to billions of dollars per year. And generally, the older the marine protected area, the greater the tourism revenue. Bill Ballantyne, who's one of my best friends in New Zealand, he called fisheries displacement an invented problem. Bill used to love criticizing scientists, maybe because he was one, but he said scientists are very good at asking questions which we're kind of paid to ask, but sometimes we invent problems. And by repeating that this problem might exist, people think it really does exist. And this is one example about fisheries displacement, because nobody ever actually looked to see, was there any effect where by banning fisheries in one place, you get more fishing elsewhere, so it depletes the fishery or has other negative effects. And it's really surprising to me that considering how much fishery data we have, we've never had an example of fisheries displacement. But last year, a group from California looked at the Global Fishing Watch global data, and they looked at the historic data of how marine protected areas were created around the world. And you would have expected that there would have been a fishing displacement and increased fishing around the marine protected areas and a depletion of fisheries around the protected areas. But in fact, they found the opposite effect, which was very surprising. But like a lot of these nice surprises, when we think about it in hindsight, it actually makes sense. So the graphs aren't the most photogenic, but here on this they have inside the marine protected area on the left, 0 to 100 kilometers outside on the right, and then further away 200 and greater than 200 further to the right. So what they observed is actually decreased fishing around the edges of the reserves in this area, 0 to 100 kilometers. So this was a surprise, and it's best explained by the spillover effect. So actually those boats fishing around the edges of the marine protected areas are getting their catch quicker. They've increased catch per unit effort. Surprise, this is what the economists said might happen. So you get more efficient fisheries, cost efficient, and they're going back with their catches already. So in fact, not only does displacement not occur, the spillover effect more than counterbalances it as a positive benefit. And another interesting example in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which has more no-take marine reserves than all of Europe, perhaps all the North Atlantic, probably. They've got 766 no-take marine reserves. And these were designed using systematic conservation planning for 30% of the Great Barrier Reef area. And it's a well-managed fishery for coral grouper. And even in this well-managed fishery, which is managed to be sustainable, the marine protected areas, although they only count as 30% of the area, they provide 55% of larvae and 47% of the commercial catch. So one of every 2 fish to the fishery is coming from the marine protected areas, even though they're no fishing areas. So I think this shows what is not surprising to indigenous peoples and many others, but maybe we got a bit lost in our science, thinking we could manage everything. That simply having areas with no fishing is a very simple and fruitful way of managing fisheries as well as protecting biodiversity. So to kind of conclude, these partly protected areas don't aim to work from those examples I've shown already. So countries are now investing hugely in calling places protected areas that are only partially protected. And most of these will have no benefits to fisheries. They'll have probably no ecological recovery. And they're really going to be a waste of money. So in fact, they're probably wasting huge amount of money with this partial protection for 30%, when if they put a fraction of the money into full protection, they'd probably get greater benefits, which would actually provide the justification and evidence to have more protected areas in the longer term. There was a very nice PhD study by John Turnbull in Australia, where he walked the coast of South Australia, and he asked people what they talk about, how they compared the fully protected, partially protected, and unprotected areas. And it was very clear that only the fully protected really were seen as valuable to people, including fishermen and others. And in fact, these partially protected were seen as a distraction. What do they call it here? Red herrings, an English phrase for a distraction, because they create an illusion of protection and consume scarce conservation resources, yet provide little or no social or ecological gain over open areas. So in fact, they don't provide any fishery gain either. So, and then I think if we asked any of our parents and business people and doctors, part protection doesn't really work in medicine, public health, and business, and it doesn't work in nature conservation either. So that's some of the 10 myths and misunderstandings, and I believe the slides will be available later, so you can if you want to take notes of them. And there are plenty of examples really of benefits to fisheries, not only the ecological benefits, which are shown through hundreds of studies. These are this paper I had was focused on the fishery benefits. And contrary to what some people might think, there's no evidence that marine protected areas reduce fishery catch. Maybe there's a temporary decline in catch if areas are created because at a local scale, which could be accommodated by giving fishermen alternative life strategies or some type of subsidy to carry them through until the spillover effect happens. So of course, you can have local situations need to take things into account. And there's no evidence of fishery displacement, the opposite. So having talked to a lot of the stakeholders and looked at our data and scientific evidence, we would argue that you got to protect biodiversity as a whole, not piece by piece, and full protection is simpler and will probably be better value for money to focus on it. So what are the limitations of our study? Well, as I pointed out, the two limitations. One is we're assuming the species are present in those areas and we don't know for sure. Maybe they were and are no longer present. And the second, we haven't looked at abundance and special important habitats for very widespread species, like some of the marine mammals and some of the widespread fish. Maybe some selected species need additional measures. For example, if you looked at sea turtles and birds which nest on land, so often around those nesting sites should be a priority for protection to protect juveniles and so on. We haven't really looked at that either, so there's plenty of work to be done. And so finally, the data layers we have could be used by people for many other purposes and used for local scale planning as a starting point for discussions at a local scale about where to protect species. And this has been successfully used using the SeaSketch platform in the Azores, as well as it was previously used in California and other countries. And so maybe going forward, how can we design marine protected areas to benefit fisheries? Well, we've got a new project just starting now called MPA for Fish. So hopefully we'll have some more answers in the next few years when that project brings us results. And I think that's my last slide and it's just coming up to the hour. So I should stop talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was very, very interesting. We have around 10 questions from the audience. But before going on that, then I just wanted to just jump in and ask you like a follow-up question on what you just said. So you mentioned about the relationship, like attributing to MPAs. What do you, in your opinion, how should planners avoid carbon first choices that could compromise biodiversity representation on MPAs?
How should they avoid carbon?
What you should prioritize when naming a new marine protected area. Whether is how can we, what are the biggest risks of integrating carbon priorities on MPA selection, and how planners can avoid carbon first over biodiversity representation?
How they can avoid carbon first?
Yes, so for example, only focusing on the economic size of it.
Oh, right.
Rather than on the biodiversity aspect, like on the representation and biodiversity. What would be the middle point there?
Yeah, well, managers have many different things to do, like parents know you have to balance many different things to run a family, you have to balance many different things to run a society. So I don't think it's ever an either or situation. But there can be win-wins, because by protecting biodiversity, you're protecting what draws down carbon dioxide and produces organic carbon and moves into sediments. So that's the whole blue carbon area of science. I wouldn't try to say that's going to affect climate change, because the main problem with climate change is emissions. And whatever we can do to increase carbon dioxide drawdown is not going to have any effect within in the next few lifetimes of people. But it's still a positive effect rather than releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. That's the same on land with forests and carbon in soils as well. We don't want to release them. But the main problem is emissions, and we just have to keep reminding stakeholders they can reduce emissions. They have been reducing emissions. Just keep doing that. The other things, if they put their effort into reducing emissions, it'll be much better than trying to toy around with carbon dioxide, carbon cycle in the ocean. And I've been reading a bit on it, and it's really complicated, and it's really hard to work out, how much carbon actually goes into the sea and how long it takes to stay there and so on. So I'd be worried about trying to sell the blue carbon idea as if it's a solution to climate change. I don't think people do, but that would be a mistake probably, because it's not going to solve the climate change emissions problem. That answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you so much. We do have many more. We have about 12 questions from the audience. I'm going to pick a few, and then the rest we can send them responses afterwards. So we have so many. Do you think?
Will I answer some of them? I can see them.
Okay. Do you think that connectivity has a role to play in identifying future spatial temporal protection for conservation?
Yes, but I don't think we need to worry about it. I have a paper which nobody cites because that's what I said. And it's a very popular subject. And of course, connectivity is important, but if connectivity in the ocean is pretty good. Species can get around much better than we can predict. We use larvae sometimes in ocean currents, but we know that larvae have behaviors, so they do or they don't follow ocean currents. And many species get around without planktonic larvae just as well as other species. So I think we underestimate how widespread and how well dispersed species are in the ocean, because most species, and we know this best on land, usually disperse further than they can actually survive. There's always species going beyond the habitat that they can live in. And people look at seeds and eDNA now, they find traces of species in areas that you don't see them growing, for example. So I think I don't think we need to worry so much about connectivity. Where it might be important is, and also it depends what people mean about connectivity. There's megafauna like whales, with particular pathways they might swimways they're called. Really nice paper by Anna Sikira last year on the megafauna tracking movements. So connectivity for individuals is very important because you don't want them being hit by ships or being caught in nets. We need that information. Well, for most species, they get around okay. But what about like the Adriatic Sea in the Mediterranean, or some areas species may be trapped? Maybe in those cases, they can't escape and use connectivity to get to more suitable areas. So yeah, we don't need to worry about everything all the time, but finding what are the real problems that we can that may be a problem that we can look at in detail is probably more effective. Will I ask some of the questions here on the... Somebody asked about the models. If they look at the shiny Apanobis, it shows you all the models. We actually use 4 different models and an ensemble model. So that's the one I've answered live.
Yeah. Well, then I have another question. So a central message of your talk is that fully protected areas like non-fishing areas reliably restore biodiversity because of the spillover effects and the benefits from it, where partially protected areas might be less effective in that regard. What does the evidence say, or do you know anything about the right mix of full and partial protection if a country, for example, wants to balance biodiversity goals and having short-term socioeconomic pressures? Like how is there any balance? Is there any?
There are some cases where partial protection works, but in those cases maybe it was really good protection. It was actually addressing the main impacts, because we don't really know what partial means. It could be like almost full protection or almost no protection. It could be anywhere in between. So in some cases it may work. Or may restore things, such as if you allow the top predators to recover maybe the food web, recovers and so on. Or maybe you stop damaging some particular habitat that was being damaged by trawling or anchoring. Yeah, and I think most countries don't do zoning within areas because it's a little bit difficult to manage zoned areas. So, but except in very, very large areas like these big marine parks, where you might have all kinds of management measures, some of which would be no take, and some would be almost business as usual in other areas of the marine park, and they might allow more tourists in some areas than others. There's been a few papers on that, and I can't remember them offhand, but I guess we're down to the individual case studies where they may or may not work depending on local situations.
Yeah, true. And also on the area that they need to protect, like whether it's big or small. We have another question. How can the representativeness of deep sea ecosystems be improved using the carbon capture criteria in BBNJ areas?
Can the current protection of the ocean that is, no. Who's this question from? Sorry, I missed some of that.
It's one of the last ones, David.
From David Alzon?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at most organic carbon in sediments is around the continental shelves and coasts. It's not actually in the deep sea. So I used to imagine it being the deep sea because everything ends up in the deep sea. But do we mean the offshore deep sea, where the sediments are largely from plankton that died and settled, or do we mean the near coast deep sea, which would have high organic carbon content?
I would say it's the offshore, yeah, because of
Yeah,
his focus on
he's
BBNJs.
probably thinking the offshore, and also, yeah, usually bottom trawling is banned in these areas already. The main threat would be seabed mining if that's allowed. So how can the representatives of deep sea ecosystems be improved? I don't know the carbon capture criterion in the areas beyond national jurisdiction offhand, so I can't. But I'd be surprised if that helped with representativeness of biodiversity. I'm not sure if there's a direct. You're kind of looking at a chemical signal and linking it back to the biodiversity because some species will like high carbon and some will be happy in low carbon areas. So I think the ideal situation is we have these species maps and range maps and those species habitats and then model using those and then test them in the field. One asked the couple of government agencies within the European Union that are leading the way. Well, the Azores is leading the way. I don't think I offer any. That's an answer to Joshua's question.
Yes.
Not just because they're hosting this seminar. Anna Kolako asked about OECM. Yeah, I think fishing closures, if they're permanent. So Iceland and the Faroese have permanent fishing closure areas to protect spawning areas for certain species of fish. So these are effectively marine protected areas, but they don't call them marine protected areas. They call them because they're managed under fishing regulations. So in those cases, if they're permanent closures, they could be OECM, and they're not allowing any other negative impacts. I think that's a very promising.
Yeah, we have a question from Hasna. It says, if site selection is mainly based on existing biodiversity patterns, how does your approach account for ecologically important transit areas used for migratory species such as seabirds, marine turtles, and other highly mobile fauna? These areas might not always appear as biodiversity hotspots, but they are essential for connectivity, seasonal movement, and life cycle support. I think we lost Mark. We will also try to answer most of your questions, and then we will leave some answers in record the session.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think we may close the webinar.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining, and we hope to see you in the next opportunity. Thank you, everybody.